Wyoming Territory, 1877, the wind never stopped here, and neither did the whispers behind her back. Josephine Tarrow held her chin high as she stepped out of the dry goods store in Sweet Clover Ridge, her basket light in her arms. Three women stood near the water pump, voices low but sharp as needles. She is near 30 and still not a child to show. Poorly. 3 years in the ground and no legacy to speak of. Josephine did not flinch. She had learned not to. Her boots clicked steady against the wooden planks of the boardwalk as she made her way toward the edge of town, to the small home she had once shared with her husband. The house stood plain and sturdy against the wind, framed by a small garden she kept with care. She had buried Lee with love, but his leaving had not taken her longing for a family with him. It lived on, steady and quiet. She had not asked for much, just a life of usefulness. A home. A child, maybe, but the world had given her silence in return. And the women of Sweet Clover Ridge, bored and bitter, had given her scorn. The first time she saw the cowboy was beneath a sky full of dust and sun. He rode into town alone, tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low over his face. His horse was lean and weary, like it had seen long miles. Folks glanced his way, curious, but he did not speak much. Just tied his horse near the livery and walked into the saloon for water and a meal. Josephine had come to town to trade eggs. She saw him as she passed, one boot propped on the rail outside the saloon, his hands dusted with trail dirt. When their eyes met, something passed between them. Not lightning, not fire, just recognition. Like he had been looking for something solid and she had been still long enough to be seen. Later that week, he showed up on her porch. "You the one grows them eggs with the blue shells?" he asked, nodding toward the small henhouse behind her. "I am," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. "You looking to buy?" "I am," he echoed her words with a hint of a smile. "Name's Xander Lowe." Josephine Tarrow. Their hands met, dry and warm. He did not look away. He started coming by every few days, first for eggs, then for bread, then just to talk. He told her he had come from Texas, trying to forget a war that had taken too much. Said he had no family left and no plans past the day in front of him. "I only know how to ride and fix fences," he said, one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sun drop behind the hills. "But I reckon I'm good at staying put if there's cause." She looked at him then, really looked. His hands were strong but gentle. His voice quiet but sure. He did not ask about her childlessness. He did not treat her like she was less. The town noticed. Whispers turned louder. "Poor man, he must not know. She cannot give him a thing. She is barren." And she knows it. Josephine kept her head high, but the words struck deep. One afternoon, she found a note tucked under her door. No name, just a line scrawled in harsh ink. "He deserves better." She burned it without a word. When Xander came by that evening, she was chopping firewood with more force than usual. "Josephine," he said gently, stepping beside her. "What happened?" She did not answer, just handed him the axe and turned away, arms tight across her chest. He set the axe down and walked to her, standing close but not touching. "You think I do not know what they say?" His voice was low, steady. "I hear it every time I go into town, but I do not care." "I do," she whispered. "More than I want to." She turned to him then, eyes wet but fierce. "They think I am empty, that I am just a shell of a woman because I never carried a child. They think you are wasting yourself on me." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. "You are not empty," he said. "You are full of strength, of kindness, of care. You listen when no one else does. You keep going when no one thanks you for it. That is more than most." She looked at him, tears slipping free. "I do not have much," she said. "I do not need much," he said back. "Just someone real." That night he stayed on her porch until the stars came out. And the next morning he came back with a hammer and nails. "I am fixing your fence," he said, "and I am staying." From then on, he was there. Not just for eggs or bread, but for planting, for mending, for dinners by firelight. He brought her a horse one day, an old mare with kind eyes. "She needs someone steady," he said. "Thought of you." They never rushed it, but it grew in the quiet ways. A touch of his hand on her back as he passed, her voice softening when she said his name. the way he stood just a little taller when she smiled at him. One morning, Josephine woke to find a small bundle on her porch. Wrapped in a blanket, crying, was a baby girl. No note. Just a child left to the wind. Josephine froze. Xander came running when he heard her call. "She is only weeks old," Josephine said, arms trembling as she held the child close. He looked at the baby, then at her. "You want to keep her?" She nodded, eyes wide. "More than anything," he smiled. "Then we will." They named her Amaline. The town was louder than ever that week. "She took in a foundling. That child is not hers. She is trying to pretend." But Josephine did not hear them anymore. She had her child, and she had Xander. And when he knelt before her one crisp morning with a simple band in hand and love in his eyes, she did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, voice full. He stood and kissed her, the baby asleep in her arms between them. They married beneath the cottonwood tree behind her house, just the three of them and the wind. And for the first time in years, Josephine Tarrow felt whole. The morning frost had not yet melted from the tall grass when Josephine stepped into the garden with Amaline bundled against her chest. The child had begun to smile in the mornings, her small mouth curling just enough to catch the light. Josephine traced the baby's cheek with the back of her finger. Xander was already at the fence line, sleeves rolled, measuring the posts he'd cut the day before. His breath came in clouds as he worked, steady and unhurried. "You always do the hard parts before breakfast," she said, kneeling by the cabbages. He leaned his weight on the post driver and looked over. "Keeps my thoughts clean." She didn't ask what he meant. She knew enough of what haunted a man who'd seen too much to guess at the rest. Instead, she stood and walked toward him with Amaline still asleep against her. "You planning to finish the west line today, if the ground stays soft enough?" He glanced at the sky. "Clouds are holding off for now." Josephine watched his hand settle at the base of the post, then measure the space between rails with his thumb. "You've done this before," she said. "Twice for cattle," he answered. "Once for a line camp that never held. This one's different." "How so?" He looked at her then, eyes not leaving hers. "This one's meant to last." She didn't blush, not anymore. Instead, she gave him a quiet nod and passed him the leather strap he used to bind the posts. By midday, Amaline was fussing, and Josephine walked her slowly along the edge of the field. Xander had paused to drink from the canteen and wipe his brow with his sleeve. "Do you remember the first time you held her?" Josephine asked, not looking at him. He studied the child's face. "She fit in my hands like she was meant to. She hasn't cried at night since you started singing to her. I don't know many songs. She doesn't seem to mind." They walked the fence line together, the sun warming the backs of their necks. Amaline drifted back to sleep. Josephine stopped near the apple tree that had barely borne fruit in 3 seasons. "I think we should have her baptized." Xander didn't answer right away. "You want it done in town?" "I'm not sure I want anyone from town involved. There's a preacher rides circuit. Tall man, long beard, always smells like pipe ash. He married my sister and her husband before the fever took them." "You trust him?" He didn't speak more than needed, and he didn't look down on us for not having lace on the table. Josephine nodded. "Ask him to come." They stood under the apple tree a while longer. A crow cawed from the ridge and the sound carried clear. "I've been thinking," Xander said, glancing down at the sleeping child. "We'll need to build on." "There's room in the back," she said. "If we clear the brush behind the shed, I'll start after the last rails are in." She reached out then, her hand settling on his forearm. "You're not restless," he turned to her. "Not when I've got purpose." She looked down at Amaline. "She's small, but she fills the house already." Xander's mouth tilted into a quiet grin. "That's the way of it." That evening, Josephine sat by the window, darning a tear in Xander's work shirt. Amaline slept in the cradle he'd built from pine boards, her breathing soft. Outside, wind stirred the shutters and the smell of cooking beans drifted from the stove. Xander came in, boots dusty, hair wind-tossed, and crossed to her without a word. He set a small tin box on the table. "What's that?" she asked. "Found it in the shed." "Thought you might want it." She opened the tin. Inside were buttons, small wooden toys, and a yellowed letter folded twice her mother's things, long forgotten in a corner after Illy passed. Josephine's breath caught. She touched the corner of the letter, then closed the tin softly. "She would have liked you," she said. "I don't need her to," he said. "I'm here for you." She looked over at him, eyes wet but steady. "You're the only man who ever saw me without looking past me." He stepped closer and rested a hand on the back of her chair. "That's because I stopped running," he said, "and you were the first thing that felt like peace." She reached up and took his hand. "Then stay here with us always." "I already am." Outside, the wind quieted. Inside, their home held the soft hush of belonging. The preacher arrived 2 weeks later, riding a mule with a crooked leg and wearing a coat patched at the elbows. He dismounted without hurry, eyes scanning the homestead, then offered Josephine a nod that felt more like respect than courtesy. Xander stood from where he'd been laying floorboards for the addition and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Reverend Grayson," he said, voice even, "thanks for coming." "I don't pass judgment," the preacher said, gazing toward the cradle resting just inside the open doorway. "Just offer the blessing where it's asked." Josephine stepped aside to let him in. The room smelled of cook-fire and sawdust, and Amaline stirred gently in her sleep. The preacher set his hat on the table and moved toward the child with a gravity Josephine hadn't expected. "I'll fetch the water," she offered, and Xander followed her to the pump. They walked in silence until the sound of the bucket filling broke it. She glanced at him, noting the way his shoulders had set tighter than usual. "You're uneasy." He met her eyes. "Not about the preacher." "Then what?" He hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking of filing for the land." Josephine's breath caught. "The full claim?" "Homestead Act's still good for it. I've already got the 5 years in Texas. I never used them." "I want to use them here." "But that means a deed in your name." He shook his head. "Ours, I want it to be ours." She looked down at the dipper in her hands. "You sure?" "I want Amaline to grow up knowing this place belongs to her family. Not just something we tend, but something that's ours by right." Josephine nodded slowly. "Then we'll do it." They returned to the house with the water, and Reverend Grayson stood waiting beside the cradle. He reached for the dipper and poured the water gently over Amaline's brow, his voice low as he spoke the words of blessing. When it was done, he looked between them. "You've given her a name, now give her a foundation." He didn't stay for supper. Just tipped his hat and mounted the mule again, riding off into the dusk. That night, the wind turned colder. Josephine gathered extra quilts while Xander fed the stove. The small room glowed amber in the lamplight, and Amaline slept wrapped in wool, her fingers curled against her cheek. Josephine sat on the floor beside the cradle, her knees drawn up, and watched the fire settle. Xander joined her, his back against the wall, knees stretched long in front of him. "I never thought I'd see another winter with someone," he said, voice low. She didn't answer right away. "I used to wonder what it would feel like to be needed. Not just useful, but needed." He looked at her. "You are." "I know that now." They sat quiet a while, the fire popping soft. Then Xander reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "What's this?" "Application for the land grant. I started it. You want to send it off tomorrow? I want us to sign it together." She took the pencil he offered and bent over the paper, careful with each letter. When she finished, she passed it back, eyes shining. Xander looked at her, then at the cradle. "We'll build that second room after the thaw." Josephine leaned her head against his shoulder. "And plant more squash. I saved seeds." "You think she'll like squash? She'll learn." He laughed once, soft and real. "We all do." They watched the fire until it burned low, and when they finally rose to blow out the lamp, the wind outside had quieted to nothing at all. Snow came late to Sweet Clover Ridge that year, waiting until the end of November before falling in a hush that blanketed the hills and softened the wind's bite. Josephine woke to the stillness. The world outside her window turned white and slow. She wrapped Amaline in a wool shawl and carried her to the hearth, where the fire Xander had banked through the night still glowed faintly. He came in from the lean-to before dawn, brushing snow from his shoulders. His breath quickened from the cold. The mare had trouble standing, he said, hanging up his coat. I rubbed her legs down and moved her feed closer. Josephine took his gloves from him and laid them near the stove. She's old. We'll need to watch her close. Xander crouched beside the cradle, brushing a finger lightly across Amaline's brow. She's sleeping easy, he murmured. Warmer in here than I expected. I packed moss in the window gaps last week, sealed tight near the sill. He looked up at her and nodded. You think of everything. She poured him coffee and handed it over with both hands, watching the way he cradled the tin mug to warm his fingers. Later that morning, a knock came at the door, not hurried, but deliberate. Josephine, with Amaline nestled against her shoulder, opened it to find Ruth Avery standing on the step, her shawl dusted with snow, cheeks wind-burnt. I won't stay long, Ruth said, eyes dropping to the baby, but I heard about the baptism. Josephine said nothing and stepped aside, letting her in out of the cold. Ruth's boots left damp prints on the floorboards. I remember when my second passed, folks didn't say much. Just looked at me the way they've looked at you. Josephine's arms tightened around Amaline. You came to say you understand. No, Ruth replied. I came to say I was wrong. Josephine blinked. We all talked, Ruth admitted. Too much, said things before we ever saw you hold her. Before we saw him stay. She looked toward the bedroom where Xander had gone to check the window latches. He built more than a fence here. Josephine shifted Amaline's weight and said, I didn't need forgiveness. I didn't come to offer it, Ruth said softly. Just to tell you you've earned more than scorn. The silence hung between them, neither warm nor cold. I'll see myself out, Ruth said, pulling her shawl tighter. If you ever want help with cloth scraps, I've got plenty. Josephine gave a small nod. The door shut behind her with a thump as the wind picked up. That evening, Xander brought in a small stack of books wrapped in oilskin. Found them at the trading post outside Laramie, he said, laying them on the table. Figured you'd want something for her when she's older. Josephine unfolded the cloth. A primer, a book of fables, and she held up the third, a journal. For you, you write more than lists. She ran her fingers along the spine. I used to copy down weather patterns. Back when Lee was still working cattle, you ever write for yourself? No, he leaned against the edge of the table. Then start. She opened the cover. Blank pages waited, crisp and untouched. Xander reached for the lantern and trimmed the wick. I want to build her a sled when the snow settles. Josephine glanced up. You think she'll be old enough next year? He laughed once, quiet and low. She'll be heavy enough if she keeps eating like she does. Josephine smiled without meaning to. We'll need to stitch her thicker mittens. I can trade for fleece next trip north. She closed the journal and ran her hand over the cover again. You planning on staying through spring? Xander's eyes met hers. I'm done planning to leave. She didn't respond with words, just crossed to him and laid her hand on his chest, palm flat over his heart. That night, when the fire burned low and the baby stirred only once, Josephine sat at the table with her new journal and wrote a single line. This is the year I began again and was not alone. Winter settled deep in Sweet Clover Ridge, snow thick enough to hush even the sharpest sounds. The addition to their home stood finished, its pine boards sealed tight with pitch, the roofline clean against the sky. Josephine hung dried lavender in the rafters to keep the mice out and the smell of summer close. Xander built a cradle bench for Amaline near the hearth, where she could watch the fire and kick her feet against the wool lining. She had begun to babble now, her sounds bright and curious, her hands reaching often for Josephine's braid or the buttons on Xander's shirts. You think she'll talk early? Josephine asked one morning, folding diapers by the stove. Xander glanced up from carving a handle for the drawknife. She's already trying to, got more to say than most grown folks I've known. Josephine smiled and folded the last square. You ever wonder what she'll be like when she's grown? I wonder what kind of world we'll give her to grow into, he said, setting the knife down. Something steadier than what I had, that's the hope. Josephine crossed to him, resting her hand over his. Then we'll make that world, one piece at a time. The first thaw came in late March. The creek behind the garden ran high with melt, and geese passed overhead in low, noisy flocks. Josephine showed Amaline the green shoots pushing through the soil, her voice soft as she named each one. "Those are onions. Those are peas. That's the sorrel come back again." Xander watched from the fence line where he was repairing a loose slat. He'd written off for the land claim in January, and the papers had come back stamped and sealed. The deed sat in a drawer beside the family Bible, both now bearing their names. One afternoon, as the sun warmed the porch steps enough to sit a while, Josephine brought out the ledger she'd used to track the hens laying. She opened to a blank page and began drafting a plan for a school circle to start in the fall just for the nearby children, half a dozen at most. Letters, numbers, maybe a bit of scripture. She had no formal training, but she knew how to teach. Xander sat beside her, Amaline balanced in his lap, chewing on a cloth ribbon. "You ever feel like you've lived two lives?" she asked, not looking up. "I reckon I have, but this one's the one I'd keep." She turned to him, pen paused. "You mean that?" "I mean I wake up every day wanting to be right here. That wasn't true before." She reached out, brushing a fleck of sawdust from the collar of his shirt. "I think I started living the day you knocked on my door." He leaned in, their foreheads touching. "Then we both arrived late but right." That spring, Josephine's name began to carry weight differently in town, not whispered with pity but spoken with a kind of caution. The school circle idea reached Ruth Avery, who offered her kitchen table for the first meeting and passed along a sack of slates left from her own children. The first lesson took place in June, under the cottonwood behind the house. Josephine wore her hair in a loose twist, Amaline asleep in a basket nearby. Xander watched from the porch, fingers idle against his coffee mug, a look in his eyes like he couldn't quite believe any of it was real. Later that evening, with the last of the children gone, Josephine sat on the edge of the bed, unlacing her boots with tired fingers. "You want to keep teaching?" Xander asked, placing a fresh basin of water beside her. She nodded. It felt right. Like I was filling a space I hadn't known was waiting. He knelt and took her foot in his hand, fingers warm against her ankle as he slipped the boot free. "You don't have to be everything." She looked at him, a slow smile rising. "But I get to be." They lay together that night with the windows open, listening to the frogs call down by the creek. Amaline slept soundly in the cradle beside them, her tiny breath steady. Josephine reached for Xander's hand beneath the quilt. "You've given me more than I ever thought was left." He turned toward her, brushing his thumb along her jaw. "You were the beginning of everything good." They kissed, slow and sure, the kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything but gave everything back. By the end of summer, the garden was full, the hens laying steady, and the school circle had grown to 9 children. Parents brought preserves and flour in trade, and Josephine turned the front room into a place of learning, the walls lined with maps and chalk. Xander built a second cradle, smaller, with care in every cut. Josephine told him in late August, her hands trembling with joy. He set down his hammer and pulled her into his arms, silent for a long moment, then whispered against her temple, "We'll be ready." When autumn came, the wind carried gold leaves past the windows, and Amaline took her first steps on the kitchen floor, laughing as she reached for Josephine's apron strings. Xander carved a small stool for her to sit beside the hearth, and by harvest, she could say Ma and Pa as clear as church bells. They celebrated the new baby's arrival the following spring, a boy born strong and wide-eyed, his cries loud enough to wake the birds. They named him Elias for memory and hope both. Josephine held him to her chest by the window, Amaline tucked at her side and watched Xander in the yard, repairing the wheel on the cart. Sunlight caught in his hair and his hands moved with quiet purpose. She turned to the children and whispered, "This is your home, this is where love lives." And it was. Years passed, but the house only grew warmer. The school circle became a gathering place, the garden a sanctuary. Xander's fence held through every storm, and he replaced each worn rail with care. Josephine filled her journal with memories, not weather. They aged together, not quickly, but enough to feel the time in their bones. Yet every morning still began with the sound of Xander's footsteps and the smell of coffee. Every evening ended with the press of his hand against hers beneath the quilts. They never left Sweet Clover Ridge, they never needed to, they had each other, and that was enough. Always.